Every night, the cemetery caretaker watched a homeless man and his dog sleep on the same grave. Tonight, he was finally going to find out why. The iron gates of the Oak Hill Cemetery didn't squeak. Arthur made sure of that. He oiled them every Sunday, a ritual of respect for the quiet city of the dead he had tended for 30 years. But tonight, the silence of the cemetery was being broken. Not by the squeak of a hinge, but by a low, rhythmic murmuring coming from the Old Quarter, the section of the graveyard dating back to the Civil War, where the oak trees were thickest and the shadows stretched like grasping fingers. Arthur watched the security monitor in his small, heated gatehouse. He sipped his lukewarm coffee, his eyes narrowing behind thick bifocals. "There he is again," Arthur grumbled, leaning forward. On the grainy black and white screen, a silhouette moved through the mist. It was a man, hunched and shuffling, wrapped in layers of oversized coats that fluttered like rags in the wind. And trotting beside him, a shadow within a shadow, was a large, limping dog. They didn't wander aimlessly, they moved with purpose. They bypassed the marble mausoleums of the town's founders and the fresh flowers of the recent arrivals. They headed straight for the far northwest corner, a place where the ground was uneven and the headstones were sinking into the earth, swallowed by decades of ivy and neglect. Arthur watched as the man stopped before a specific, modest grave. The man didn't just visit. He didn't just kneel. He laid a piece of cardboard down on the frozen earth, directly on top of the grave. Then, he curled up, pulling the dog into his chest. They went to sleep. "That's it," Arthur muttered, grabbing his flashlight and his heavy wool coat. "It's 20 degrees out there. I can't have a frozen vagrant on my conscience. Not tonight." Arthur had seen plenty of strange things in 3 decades as a groundskeeper. He'd seen teenagers holding seances, grieving widows talking to thin air, and historians rubbing charcoal on slate. But he had never seen anyone use a grave as a bed. This was the 3rd night in a row. The first night, Arthur had let it slide, thinking it was a one-time desperation. The second night, he had felt uneasy. Tonight, curiosity and duty warred in his chest. Who sleeps on a grave? And more importantly, whose grave was comfortable enough to rest a weary soul? The walk to the Old Quarter was long and biting. The wind in Pennsylvania in November had teeth. Arthur's boots crunched loudly on the frost-covered grass, a sound that usually announced his presence long before he arrived. But the man didn't move. When Arthur finally reached the corner, shining his heavy maglite beam onto the scene, the tableau was heartbreakingly still. The man was a heap of mismatched fabric, dirty tweed, ripped denim, a scarf that looked like a dish rag. The dog, a golden retriever mix with a coat matted with burrs and mud, lifted its head. It didn't bark. It didn't growl. It just looked at Arthur with eyes that held a profound, ancient exhaustion. It thumped its tail once, a pathetic sound against the cardboard. "Hey," Arthur called out, keeping his voice firm but not shouting. "You can't be here. The gate's locked at sundown." The pile of rags stirred. A head emerged from the collar of the coat. The man was old, perhaps in his late 60s, with a beard that hung to his chest in white, tangled ropes. His face was a map of exposure, reddened cheeks, cracked lips, skin weathered like old leather. But his eyes were surprisingly clear. They were a piercing, intelligent gray that seemed out of place on a man sleeping in the dirt. "I apologize, Keeper," the man rasped. His voice was like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "We meant no disturbance, just resting." "This is private property," Arthur said, shining the light slightly away from the man's face to be humane. "And it's freezing. There's a shelter on 4th Street, St. Jude's. They take dogs." The man shook his head slowly. He reached out a trembling hand and stroked the dog's head. "Barnaby doesn't do well in crowds. And we have an appointment." "An appointment?" Arthur scoffed. "It's midnight. The only appointments here are permanent ones." The man smiled, a sad, broken expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Precisely." He sat up fully, shivering as the cold air hit his chest. He looked down at the grave he was sleeping on. It was completely obscured. A thick, suffocating blanket of English ivy and dead leaves covered the stone. It looked like it hadn't been cleaned since the Nixon administration. "You're sleeping on someone's resting place," Arthur said, stepping closer. "It's disrespectful." "On the contrary," the man whispered. "It's the only respect left." Arthur sighed. He wasn't a cruel man. He looked at the dog, Barnaby, who was shivering now that the man's body heat had shifted. "Look," Arthur said, his tone softening. "I can't let you stay. Liability, rules, all that. Plus, if you die out here, the paperwork is a nightmare. Come to the gatehouse. I've got a space heater and some coffee. You can thaw out, then you move on. Deal?" The man looked at the grave, then at Barnaby, then at Arthur. "Only if I can come back tomorrow." "We'll see," Arthur hedged. In the bright fluorescent light of the gatehouse, the man looked even worse. He smelled of wood smoke and damp wool. He drank the coffee Arthur gave him with hands that shook violently. Barnaby curled up under the table, instantly asleep. "I'm Arthur," the caretaker said, sitting on his stool. "Jacob," the man replied. He didn't offer a last name. "So, Jacob, why that spot? It's the coldest corner of the yard. Wind whips right off the river." Jacob held the mug with both hands, staring into the black liquid. "It's quiet. And I promised." "Promised who? The person buried there?" Jacob nodded. "A long time ago. I promised I wouldn't leave them alone in the dark." Arthur studied him. Mental illness was common among the homeless population in the city. He assumed Jacob was just another lost soul, perhaps fixing his delusion on a random grave. "Do you know who's buried there?" Arthur asked. Jacob looked up. "Do you?" Arthur paused. "No. To be honest, I don't go back to the old quarter much. Most of those families died out or moved away 50 years ago. The trust fund for that section ran dry in the 90s. It's mostly overgrown now." "Yes," Jacob said softly. "Forgotten. That's the word. Forgotten by everyone." He took a sip of coffee. "I was a different man once, Arthur. I wore a suit like the men who pay you. I had a watch that cost more than a car. I thought I controlled the world." "What happened?" "Life," Jacob said simply. "Life happened. And then death happened. And I realized that the suit and the watch didn't mean a damn thing if you couldn't stop the things that mattered from slipping through your fingers." He finished the coffee and stood up. He looked remarkably dignified for a man wearing 3 coats. "Thank you for the warmth, Arthur. Barnaby and I will be going now." "You can't go back to the grave," Arthur warned. "I won't," Jacob lied. Arthur knew it was a lie. "We'll find a bridge." Arthur watched them leave, the man and his dog disappearing into the darkness of the city streets outside the gates. He felt a strange unease settling in his gut. The next night, they were back. Arthur watched the monitor. Same time, same slow walk, same spot. Jacob laid out his cardboard on the ivy-covered mound, curled up with Barnaby, and went to sleep. Arthur decided to let them be. It wasn't snowing, and he felt a strange reluctance to disturb the ritual. This continued for a week. Every night, Jacob and Barnaby guarded the mysterious, overgrown grave, and every morning, before the sun rose and the first visitors arrived, they were gone, leaving no trace but flattened grass. The mystery of the grave began to gnaw at Arthur. Why that specific stone? In a cemetery of 10,000 souls, why did Jacob choose that one? Was it a relative, a lover, or just a random obsession? On a Tuesday afternoon, when the cemetery was quiet, Arthur took his bucket, a scrub brush, and a pair of shears. He walked to the old quarter. He stood over the grave. Without Jacob there, it looked pathetic. Just a hump of green weeds in the shadow of a dying elm tree. Arthur knelt down. "All right," he grumbled to the silent air. "Let's see who's got the homeless honor guard." He began to cut away the ivy. The vines were thick and woody, clinging stubbornly to the stone. It took him 20 minutes just to clear the vegetation. Beneath the greenery was a layer of thick, black moss and grime. He poured water from his bucket and applied the scrub brush. He scrubbed hard, the bristles rasping against the granite. Slowly, Letters began to emerge. It wasn't a standard limestone marker. This was high-quality granite, the kind that cost a fortune a few decades ago. It was a small stone, not a towering monument. The first word to appear was a name. Elizabeth. Arthur paused. A woman? Jacob's wife, maybe? He scrubbed lower. Beloved daughter. A child. Arthur felt a pang of sympathy. Jacob was grieving a child. That explained the devotion. That explained the madness. Losing a child could break a man in ways that couldn't be fixed. Arthur scrubbed the dates. 1995 to 2001. 6 years old. A tragedy. But it was the inscription at the bottom, the epitaph, that made Arthur stop scrubbing. He stared at the wet stone, reading the words that had been hidden for 20 years. Her laughter was the music of our lives. And below that, in smaller letters, survived by her loving father, J. Sterling. Arthur dropped the scrub brush. It clattered against the granite. He knew that name. Everyone in Pennsylvania over the age of 50 knew that name. James Sterling. 25 years ago, James Sterling was the king of steel. He was a titan of industry, a philanthropist, the wealthiest man in the tri-state area. He had built the library. He had built the hospital wing. He was on the cover of magazines. And then, his life ended. Not his physical life, but his life. Arthur remembered the news stories, the fire, the massive, tragic fire at the Sterling estate on Christmas Eve. An electrical fault in the Christmas tree lights. The mansion had burned to the ground in under an hour. James Sterling had survived. He had been found on the lawn, burned and screaming, held back by 3 firefighters as he tried to run back into the inferno. His wife didn't make it, and his 6-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, didn't make it. After the funeral, James Sterling vanished. The tabloids speculated for years. Some said he moved to Europe. Some said he drank himself to death in Mexico. Some said he was in a mental institution. Eventually, the world stopped asking. The company was sold off, the ruins of the house were bulldozed, and James Sterling became a ghost story. Arthur stood up, his knees cracking. He looked at the grave, clean and stark in the afternoon light. The homeless man. Jacob. James Sterling. The man sleeping on the dirt wasn't a vagrant. He was the owner of the plot. He was the man who had likely paid for the very gates Arthur oiled every Sunday. He was a man who had possessed everything, lost the only things that mattered, and had spent the last 2 decades punishing himself, staying as close to his daughter as the laws of physics allowed. That night, the temperature dropped to 5 degrees. A polar vortex was descending on the state. The news warned of frostbite in minutes. Arthur paced the gatehouse. He watched the clock. Midnight. He looked at the monitor. There they were, the silhouette of the man and the dog. They were moving slower tonight. The wind was brutal, whipping Jacob's coat around him. Arthur saw them reach the grave. He saw Jacob stop. On the screen, Arthur saw Jacob freeze. He was looking at the grave. Even in the grainy footage, Arthur could see the man's posture shift. He saw the grave was clean. He saw the white granite shining in the moonlight. Jacob dropped to his knees. He ran his hands over the stone Arthur had cleaned. Arthur grabbed his coat, his keys, and a heavy wool blanket. He didn't take the flashlight this time. He knew the way. He drove the cemetery maintenance truck, ignoring the rule about driving on the grass. He needed to get there fast. When he pulled up to the old quarter, headlights washed over the scene. James, was curled into a ball on top of the clean grave. He wasn't shivering anymore. That was a bad sign. Barnaby was barking frantically, nudging the man's face with his wet nose, trying to rouse him. Arthur jumped out of the truck. "James!" he yelled. The name cut through the wind. The man on the ground stirred. He lifted his head slowly. His face was pale, blue at the lips. "You," James whispered. "You cleaned it." "Get in the truck," Arthur commanded, his voice shaking with adrenaline. "Get in the truck right now, Mr. Sterling. You're dying out here." At the mention of his real name, the man flinched. He looked at Arthur with eyes that were full of shame and shock. "No," James croaked. "I can't leave her. It's It's the anniversary. The fire. It was tonight, Christmas Eve. Arthur looked at his watch. It was December 24th. He hadn't even realized. She's not on the ground, James, Arthur said, his voice choking up. She's not in the cold. But you are. And if you die tonight, who remembers her? Who visits her? James looked at the stone. Beloved daughter. I failed her, James wept, the tears freezing on his face. I promised I'd keep her safe. I promised. You're keeping her memory safe, Arthur said, grabbing the man under the arms and hoisting him up. James was light, terrifyingly light. But you can't do that if you're a popsicle. Come on, Barnaby needs you. At the mention of the dog, James seemed to snap back to reality. He looked at Barnaby, who was whining and shivering. Barnaby, James whispered. Okay, for the dog. Arthur helped him into the heated cab of the truck. Barnaby leaped in, curling onto James's lap. Arthur didn't take him to a shelter. He took him to the gatehouse. He cranked the heat up to 80 degrees. He made soup. He pulled a bottle of whiskey from his bottom drawer and poured a generous shot into 2 mugs. For an hour they sat in silence, the only sound the wind howling outside and the ticking of the clock. Finally, the color began to return to James's face. He stroked Barnaby's fur, staring at the wall. I didn't want anyone to know, James said softly. When I left, I just walked away. I left the money, the accounts, the property. I walked until my shoes fell apart. I wanted to be cold. I wanted to hurt, because she hurt. Penance, Arthur said. Yes, penance. James looked at Arthur. Why did you clean it? Because a father shouldn't have to claw through weeds to see his daughter's name, Arthur said. And because I figured if you were willing to freeze to death for it, the least I could do was scrub the moss off. James held Arthur's gaze. A silent communication passed between the 2 older men, an understanding of duty, grief, and the burdens men carry. I can't go back to the world, Arthur, James said. I can't be James Sterling again. He died in the fire too. I don't expect you to be, Arthur said. But you can't sleep on the ground anymore. Look at your dog. He's getting old. He has arthritis. You're punishing him too. James looked down at Barnaby. The dog looked back with pure adoration. I hadn't thought of it that way. Arthur took a deep breath. He was about to break about 5 different cemetery board rules, but he didn't care. Listen, I'm 64. My knees are shot. This place is too big for one man. There's a spare room in the back of this gatehouse. It's nothing fancy, just a cot and a sink, but it's warm. James looked up, startled. Arthur, I need a night watchman, Arthur interrupted. Someone to keep an eye on the old quarter. Someone who knows the quiet. I can't pay you much, probably just under the table. But it comes with a roof for the dog. James looked around the small, cluttered gatehouse. It smelled of oil and coffee, the smells of the living. I can still visit her? James asked. Every night, Arthur said. But you sleep in a bed. Deal? James Sterling, the man who had once built skyscrapers, looked at the humble caretaker. Tears welled in his eyes again, but this time they weren't from the cold. Deal, James whispered. 6 months later. The spring thaw had arrived early in Pennsylvania. The Oak Hill Cemetery was bursting with color. Dogwood trees were blooming, and the grass was a vibrant, impossible green. A black sedan pulled up to the main gates. A young woman in a sharp business suit got out, looking at a map on her phone. She looked confused. She walked up to the gatehouse where an old man was sweeping the front step. Excuse me, she said. I'm looking for the caretaker? I called the city and they said there was a new registry for the historical section. The man stopped sweeping. He leaned on his broom. He was clean-shaven, though his face was lined with deep grooves. He wore a simple gray work uniform with the name Jacob stitched over the pocket. A golden retriever sat calmly at his feet, watching the woman. I can help you, Jacob said. His voice was strong, clear. I look after the old quarter. Oh, wonderful, the woman said. My grandmother is buried there. We thought the grave was lost. We haven't been able to find it for decades. What was the name? Jacob asked. Eleanor Vance, she said. Jacob smiled. Ah, yes, Mrs. Vance. Plot 402 under the willow tree. I cleaned the stone just last week. The moss likes that side of the hill. The woman looked relieved. Thank you so much. It's nice to know someone is watching over them. Someone is always watching, Jacob said. He watched the woman walk away toward the old quarter. He watched her stop at the grave, put her hand to her mouth, and cry at the sight of the pristine, cared-for stone. Arthur walked out of the gatehouse, holding 2 mugs of coffee. He handed one to Jacob. You missed a spot on the walkway, Arthur teased gently. Jacob took the coffee, looking out over the rows of headstones, stretching endlessly into the morning mist. In the distance, the grave of Elizabeth Sterling gleamed white and perfect, surrounded by fresh tulips, Jacob's favorite flower. I'll get it, Jacob said, taking a sip. I've got time. Barnaby let out a contented sigh and laid his head on Jacob's boot. The billionaire was dead. The homeless man was gone. But the keeper was finally home.